Once upon a time, in the rolling hills just outside Lystra, a warm wind stirred through the wild thyme and olive trees. The house was small, its stones weathered and sun-bleached, but the garden behind it grew thick with rosemary, vines, and climbing fig. Inside, the scent of clay, wool, and bread lingered, as if time had stopped there. Lois moved slowly, not because she was weak, but because she had learned the rhythm of patience. She wore a faded blue scarf over her silver-streaked hair and held a wooden spindle in her hand. The room was dim, lit by the last rays of sun bouncing through the stone archway. A gentle clinking came from the sheep pen outside where Eunice had gone to check on the youngest lamb. The peace of evening had settled, but Lois's thoughts were stirring. She remembered a time, not long ago, when the road to Lystra wasn't safe. Roman soldiers passed through often, and tension hummed like a bee trapped in a jar. Many women stayed silent about their faith, but not Lois. She had hidden the scriptures in the folds of her garments. She had whispered truth when others only dared to hum lullabies. That was how it began, a whisper of truth over the cradle. A quiet prayer by the doorpost, a gentle correction when Timothy's voice grew sharp with pride, and through it all, a steady flame of faith that burned quietly, like an oil lamp in a dark house. Lois stood up slowly and walked to where Timothy lay. She bent and brushed a piece of straw from his forehead. "You're going to do great things," she said softly, even though he couldn't hear her. Behind her, Eunice came in with a creak of the door and a soft smile. He lasted longer than usual. "He's hungry for the word," Lois said. "He gets it from you." Lois gave a low chuckle. "He gets it from God. I just made sure he heard it." They stood together in the doorway, looking out at the deepening night. The stars were beginning to appear one by one, like tiny promises pinned to the sky. Eunice's voice was quieter now. "Do you think he's ready to learn more, to listen to someone bigger than us?" Lois didn't answer right away. She watched a cricket hop across the stone step. "He's ready," she said. "But that doesn't mean we stop." "Stop what?" "Tending the fire." She turned back toward the room where Timothy still lay, his hand resting on the scroll. Not a message from a king, not a proclamation from a priest, just words. Words passed from mother to daughter, from grandmother to child, and those words had power. In time, they would grow inside the boy like seeds in good soil. In time, Timothy would walk with Paul, preach in cities, and shepherd churches. But for now, he was just a boy. And she was just a grandmother, spinning wool, praying quietly, tending the fire. And that was enough. The next morning, the soft cooing of doves drifted through the window before the sun had fully crested the hills. A rooster crowed in the distance. Lois was already up, pressing her palms into a round ball of dough, her movements calm and steady. Timothy sat at the table, chewing on a fig and blinking sleep from his eyes. His curls were messy. The scroll from the night before was rolled neatly beside his elbow. "Grandma," he mumbled between bites, "was David really just a boy when he fought the giant?" Lois didn't look up from her work. "He was younger than you are now." Timothy's eyes widened, but he wasn't scared. "Oh, I'm sure he was," she said, shaping the dough into a smooth round. "But he trusted God more than he feared the giant." Timothy paused, chewing slower now. "Do you think I'll ever do something like that?" Lois finally looked up. Her eyes were kind, but serious. "That depends." "On what?" "On what you do with the faith that's been planted in you." Just then, Eunice came in with a full jar of water from the well, brushing dust from her skirts. "The road's already busy," she said. "Traders heading out to Derby. I heard them talking about a teacher in Iconium, one who speaks with power." Lois raised an eyebrow. "Power?" Eunice nodded, setting down the jar. "They say he heals the sick, preaches about a man named Jesus." Timothy leaned forward. "Can we go hear him, Mama? Please?" "Slow down," Eunice said, smiling. "We don't even know if he's coming this way." Lois, however, stood still. She wiped her hands on her apron and walked toward the open door. Her eyes scanned the horizon, where the dusty road curved between olive trees and vanished behind the hills. "Jesus," she whispered. "You've heard of him?" Eunice asked. "Not much. Only what the travelers say when they pass, that he was crucified by the Romans, but his followers still live as though he's alive." Timothy jumped up. "If he really rose from the dead, that changes everything." Lois smiled but didn't answer right away. Her fingers toyed with the edge of her scarf. Then she said, "Truth always changes everything, child. But it takes faith to live like it." For a moment all three stood quietly, the sounds of the village rising faintly in the background, goats bleating, water sloshing, wheels creaking along the dusty path. Then a soft sound reached them. Footsteps. Not hurried like the merchants, not clumsy like the children running after carts. These were steady, purposeful. Timothy darted to the edge of the path and peeked around the garden wall. "It's just two men," he said. "One has gray hair, and the other—" Lois joined him. Her eyes squinted against the morning light. The second man, tall, dark-bearded, and wrapped in a plain cloak, was speaking to the older one with warmth and urgency. They paused near the olive tree and knelt in prayer before continuing up the road toward town. Eunice stepped up behind them. "Do you think—" "I don't know," Lois whispered, "but I have a feeling." Timothy watched until the men disappeared around the bend. Then he turned back toward Lois, eyes shining. "Can we go? If they're preaching, can we go?" Lois placed a hand gently on his shoulder. "We'll see. For now, finish your fig." And though her tone was calm, her heart was stirring. Because something had shifted in the wind, something quiet but powerful. She didn't know it yet, but soon the teacher named Paul would speak in their town. And Timothy would never be the same. End of part 2 of 14. The sky turned gold and lavender as the sun lowered behind the olive groves. That evening, Lois sat on the porch with her hands resting in her lap, a basket of mending untouched beside her. Her thoughts were weaving a different kind of thread. Inside, Eunice stirred lentils over the fire. Timothy sat cross-legged on the floor, trying to copy Hebrew letters onto a scrap of old parchment. His brow furrowed as he misshaped the tail of a lamed for the third time. "Lamed always stands tall," Lois said gently from the doorway, "like a shepherd watching over the flock." Timothy groaned. "But it leans too far, like a tired donkey." She chuckled, coming inside to sit beside him. "Then give it rest. Try again tomorrow." "But what if Paul speaks tomorrow?" he said quickly. "What if we miss him?" Lois raised an eyebrow. "You've already given him a name?" "That's what one of the traders called him," Eunice chimed in from the pot. "Paul of Tarsus, a preacher who used to arrest believers." Timothy blinked. "Wait, arrest them?" "Before he believed himself," Lois said, picking up her spindle. "He was once Saul, then something changed him." Timothy leaned forward, eager. What changed him? Lois gave the spindle a gentle twist. The wool danced around her fingers. Grace, she said. Grace will change a man faster than fear ever could. There was a silence, thoughtful and thick like honey. Timothy chewed on the edge of his parchment. Then he asked, Grandma, why do you believe all this? Lois looked up. The fire crackled. The room was warm and dim. Because I've seen what happens when people put their faith in idols, she said softly. And I've seen what happens when people put their faith in the living God. One leaves you hollow. The other fills you with life. Timothy was quiet. Then, do you think Paul will talk about Jesus? Lois nodded slowly. I think that's all he talks about. Later that night, after the dishes were cleaned and the house had fallen quiet, Lois walked alone into the garden. The moon lit the path, silvering the leaves, and the cool air smelled of earth and mint. She knelt beside a patch of herbs, her knees pressing into the soft dirt, and looked up at the stars. "Oh Lord," she whispered, "I don't need a miracle. I just need direction. If this is the time, if this man truly preaches your son, let us hear it. Let Timothy hear it." She paused, her fingers brushing a sprig of hyssop. "You gave me faith, and I passed it to Eunice. And now this boy. He burns like a wick ready for flame. Just show us the way." As she stood to go, a breeze lifted the edge of her scarf. From far off, closer than she expected, she heard the faint echo of a voice. "The God who made the world and everything in it does not live in temples built by hands." Lois turned, startled. The voice carried gently, as though it rode the wind straight into her garden. It was coming from the town square. She didn't run. She didn't shout. She simply turned toward the house and said quietly, "Timothy, get your shoes." Because she knew the time had come. Timothy's sandals slapped the dirt as he hurried beside Lois through the winding paths of Lystra. The moonlight bounced off the stone walls and the night pulsed with quiet expectation. Lois didn't say much, just kept her hand firm on his shoulder to guide him. When they reached the square, the crowd was small. Not a festival crowd, not a mob, but enough to press shoulder to shoulder. Townsfolk, shepherds, a few curious Greeks, even 2 Roman guards leaned against a wall, pretending not to listen. At the center stood 2 men. One was older, grizzled, with sharp eyes and scars that told stories. That was Barnabas. But it was the other one who held the crowd with his voice, Paul. His robe was dusty, his face lean, but his eyes shone like firelight. Lois held her breath. "You've heard of the God of Israel," Paul was saying, "the one who parted the sea and fed manna in the wilderness. But I've come to tell you, he has done something greater. He raised Jesus from the dead. And now, forgiveness is not earned by temple rituals. It's given freely by grace." Timothy's eyes were wide, drinking in every word. "Is he saying that the Messiah already came?" he whispered. Lois didn't answer. She couldn't. Her chest was too full. She gripped his hand tighter. A man near the front scoffed, "This Jesus you speak of, wasn't he crucified? Isn't that proof he failed?" Paul's voice didn't flinch. "No, it's proof he succeeded, because death is the final enemy and he broke it." The crowd murmured. "Some will mock," Paul continued, "but some will believe. And to those who believe, you'll find a new kind of life, a life filled with hope, power, purpose." Then suddenly, Paul's gaze landed on Timothy. Not just a glance, a pause. You, boy, he said gently. I don't know your name, but I see it in your eyes. You've been taught. You've been waiting. Timothy blinked, startled. Me? What's your name? Timothy, sir. Paul smiled. Timothy, don't be afraid of your youth. God is calling all generations, and I believe your faith, if it's real, will not be small. A hush fell over the crowd. Lois's heart thudded. She hadn't expected that. She had come for a word, a glimpse of truth, but instead her grandson had been called out, and strangely, it didn't scare her. It felt right. Back at the house, after the crowd dispersed and the square emptied, Timothy paced in circles, talking a mile a minute. Did you hear what he said? He knew I believed. Grandma, Mama, do you think I could do what he does? Travel, teach, preach? Eunice looked worried. You're just a boy, Timothy. But David was just a boy, he shot back. You said so yourself. Lois laughed softly. You may preach before your grown child, but faith isn't built on a single night. It's built one choice at a time. Timothy slowed. What do I do now? Lois leaned in close. We keep tending the fire. And if Paul comes back? Then we'll be ready. Outside, the stars shimmered. But inside that small house in Lystra, a bigger light had begun to burn, and it would not go out. The days that followed were quiet, but not the kind of quiet that feels empty. It was the kind of quiet when seeds are under the soil, doing their deep, hidden work. Timothy spent every spare moment scribbling on bits of parchment, asking Lois to tell the stories again, about Abraham's faith, about Esther's courage, about Jeremiah's tears. He hung on every word like it was a treasure, and Lois gave them freely, her voice patient and warm. One afternoon, while the breeze tugged lazily at the grapevines, Timothy sat outside tracing Hebrew letters into the dust with a stick. Why do we write it down if we already know it in our hearts? He asked. Lois sat beside him on a worn stool, stitching the edge of a tunic. She smiled. Because hearts forget, she said, but words remind. God wrote his laws down too, didn't he? Timothy nodded and scratched a verse into the dirt. The fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom. Then he frowned. Do you think Paul will come back? He might, Lois replied, but that's not the question. Timothy looked confused. It's not. The real question, she said slowly, is what you'll do with your faith if he doesn't. The stick stilled in his hand. What do you mean? I mean, she said, setting her stitching down, faith isn't just for when the preacher is around, or when the crowd is listening. Real faith shows up in how you treat your mother, in how you work, in how you speak when no one else is watching. Timothy looked down at the verse he'd written. So, even in the dust? Especially in the dust, Lois said with a wink. He sat quietly for a long time, letting the wind brush over his face, thinking. Then he asked, Grandma, do you ever wish you had done more? Lois blinked, caught off guard. More? You know, gone somewhere, preached. Like Paul. She didn't answer right away. She picked up a handful of soil and let it fall slowly through her fingers. No, she said, because this... She gestured to him, to Eunice inside, to the house, the garden, the dirt. This is what God gave me to tend, and he's the one who decides what blooms. Timothy tilted his head. So I could bloom into something big? You could bloom into something holy, Lois said softly, and that's even better. That night, while Eunice hummed over the dishes and the fire flickered low, Lois sat beside Timothy's bed, brushing his hair with her fingers the way she used to when he was smaller. He turned toward her, his eyes already half closed. "Grandma." "Yes, love." "If Paul comes back, I want to learn everything. I want to go with him, even if it's hard." Lois leaned down and kissed his forehead. "Then we'll be ready," she whispered. And in the quiet of that little house in Lystra, with the wind outside rustling through the vines, something invisible took root. It wasn't loud, it wasn't proud, but it was strong. A faith deep enough to shape the future. Morning broke with a cry, not from a rooster or a sheep, but from a boy in the village. Lois heard it before she opened her eyes. By the time she stepped outside, Timothy was already at the gate, his breath fast and shallow. "Mama said there was trouble near the well," he called back to her. Lois didn't ask questions. She tied her scarf and followed. Down near the edge of the olive grove, a small group had gathered. A boy from the next house, Jonan, was sitting on the ground, holding his arm and wincing in pain. His tunic sleeve was torn, and blood streaked his elbow. "He fell from the fig tree," someone muttered. "Was chasing a bird again." Timothy knelt beside him. "You're gonna be okay," he said quickly. "It's just scraped." But Jonan's face twisted. "Hurts worse than it looks." Lois pushed gently through the crowd and knelt beside both boys. "Let me see," she said softly. Her hands were weathered, but gentle. She cleaned the cut with water from her flask, humming under her breath as she worked. "Why do you always hum when people are hurt?" Timothy whispered. "Because pain listens better when you're quiet," Lois replied. Once the bandage was tied, Jonan smiled weakly. "Thanks, Miss Lois." "Don't climb fig trees before breakfast," she teased. "It makes them grumpy." The crowd laughed softly. Jonan's mother arrived, thanked her, and took him home. As they walked back, Timothy kicked at a rock. "I want to help people, too." "You just did," Lois said. "But I want to do more, big things." Lois gave him a sideways glance. "You think helping a neighbor isn't big?" He shrugged. "You know what Paul said," she reminded him. "Real faith shows up in small things first." Timothy was quiet. Then a question came from deep inside him. "What if I'm not brave enough?" Lois stopped walking. The breeze tugged gently at their clothes. Olive branches swayed over their heads. "You will be," she said simply. "But it won't come all at once. Bravery grows, like roots." He looked up at her. "What do I do while it grows?" "You water it," she said, placing a hand over his heart. "With truth, with obedience, and with quiet moments like this." That night, as twilight settled like soft cloth over the hills, Lois sat weaving by the fire. Timothy lay nearby, watching the flames. "Grandma?" he asked. "Yes?" "Do you think Paul was ever scared?" She paused, then answered honestly, "Yes. But faith doesn't mean you're never scared. It means you keep going anyway." Timothy nodded slowly. Outside, the wind carried a new scent. Smoke, faint, but sharp. "Someone's burning olive wood," Lois said. "They say it smells like wisdom." "Maybe I'll smell like that someday," Timothy mumbled. Lois smiled. "You already do." It was nearly a month before they saw Paul again. The mornings had blurred together, grinding grain, mending sandals, gathering figs. But every evening, Timothy would race to the highest hill above their home and scan the horizon, just in case. Then, one dusty afternoon, as the wind tugged at the clothes on the line, Eunice called out from the gate, "Someone's coming!" Lois and Timothy stepped outside. A figure approached, limping slightly, a walking staff in his hand and a worn leather bag slung over his shoulder. Paul. His robe was patched. His face looked tired, but his eyes were just as alive. "Paul!" Timothy ran to him without thinking. Paul smiled. "So you remember me." Lois walked slowly, watching the man carefully. He greeted her with a respectful nod. "Lois, mother of faith." She tilted her head. "You flatter me." "I speak the truth," Paul said. "Your daughter has faith. Your grandson has fire. And both began with your prayers." They welcomed him in. Water was poured. Bread was shared. Timothy sat on the floor again, like last time, only now with his back straighter and questions already forming in his mouth. Paul spoke of cities, Antioch, Iconium, Derbe, of men who listened and men who threw stones, of miracles and hardships, of preaching in synagogues and sleeping under stars. His voice didn't brag, it burned. "Why do you keep going?" Timothy asked. "Even when it's hard?" Paul looked at him and said, "Because the message is worth my whole life." That silenced even Timothy. Later, when the sun began to set, Paul rose to leave. "I won't be here long," he said. "I'm heading to strengthen the churches, but I wanted to see you again." "Wait," Timothy blurted, standing up. "Take me with you." Eunice froze by the table. Lois narrowed her eyes. Paul looked surprised, but only for a moment. Then he turned to Lois. "I see it in him. He's ready to learn." Eunice whispered, "He's just a boy." Paul answered gently, "So was I once, but someone believed in me." Timothy looked at Lois. She didn't speak at first. Her hands folded over each other. Her eyes stayed fixed on the boy she had rocked to sleep, the one she had prayed over, the one who now wanted to leave. Then she said, "He has faith, but promise me you'll grow it with truth, not with noise." Paul nodded. "Truth is all I have." "And when he stumbles?" she asked. "I'll remind him who he belongs to." Timothy's heart beat like a drum. He wasn't sure if he should cry or cheer. "Go then," Lois said softly. "But don't forget what was planted here." "I won't," Timothy whispered. "I promise." Paul placed a hand on the boy's shoulder. "Pack light, but bring the word." Lois turned back toward the garden. She didn't say goodbye. She simply picked up her spindle and kept spinning. Because the thread of faith had already been woven, and now it was ready to go. The morning Timothy left, the house was silent. No one said much over breakfast. Eunice folded and refolded a linen tunic. Lois stirred porridge she didn't eat. Timothy sat with his traveling bag packed, sandals strapped tight, and a scroll clutched to his chest. His heart thudded so loudly he was sure the whole room could hear it. "I made you a pouch for your writing tools," Eunice said at last, handing him a small stitched bag. "And I tucked in some dried figs and honeyed dates. You'll need strength." "Thanks, Mama." She opened her mouth like she wanted to say something more, but then she just nodded and stepped back. Timothy turned to Lois. "Grandma, is there anything you want me to remember?" She didn't answer right away. Then she walked over, took his face in her hands, and looked into his eyes. "Yes," she said. "Remember that roots matter more than wings. You'll go far, Timothy. but never forget where your faith was born. I won't, he whispered, throat tight. She kissed his forehead. Then go, child. Go in grace. Outside, Paul waited at the edge of the garden, his walking staff planted firmly in the dirt. Beside him stood a few companions, travelers who had joined him on the road. They looked strong, experienced. Timothy suddenly felt small. But then Paul turned and smiled. Ready, young one? Timothy glanced back one last time. Lois stood in the doorway, her scarf blowing gently in the morning wind. She didn't wave. She didn't cry. But she gave him a look that said, "Go be everything God made you to be." And so he stepped forward. They walked for hours, first through familiar hills, then through lands Timothy had only heard about in bedtime stories. Paul talked as they walked, his voice full of purpose. You'll see things that trouble you, Paul said. People will question your youth, your background, your boldness, but don't let them crush your calling. How do I keep going if I get afraid? Timothy asked. Paul pointed to a mustard plant growing beside the road. You see that? Timothy nodded. Faith that size can move mountains. Timothy smiled, remembering a similar line from Lois. At nightfall, they stopped near a grove of cypress trees. A fire was lit. Bread was broken. The stars came out, same as always, but they felt closer now, like they were leaning in to listen. Paul leaned back against his pack. Why did you come, Timothy? Timothy paused. The firelight flickered in his eyes. Because my grandmother believed in something, he said, and now I believe it too. Paul nodded. Then let's make sure the world hears it. And beneath that quiet sky, with calloused feet and an open heart, the boy who once traced scripture in the dust took his first step toward becoming a shepherd of souls. The wind came without warning. One moment the sky was calm, painted soft with morning light. The next, clouds twisted across the hills like they'd been chasing the travelers all night. Paul and his companions picked up their pace, cloaks snapping in the wind, eyes narrowing against the dust. Timothy pulled his scarf tighter around his face. Is it always like this on the road? He shouted over the growing howl. Paul grinned. Only when you're headed somewhere important. Lightning cracked in the distance. A wild flash lit the path ahead, then thunder chased it, loud enough to shake the leaves. Cave! One of the travelers yelled, pointing toward a rocky outcrop in the hillside. They scrambled toward shelter just as the skies opened. Rain poured like a river from the sky, drenching the earth in moments. The group ducked into the cave, breathless and dripping. Inside, Timothy shook water from his bag and checked the scroll Lois had given him. Still dry. He breathed a sigh of relief. Paul looked over, amused. That scroll important? Timothy nodded, wiping his forehead. It's from my grandmother. She said it was the first scripture she ever copied by hand. Paul's smile faded into something deeper. Then that scroll is worth more than gold. They built a small fire near the cave's mouth. Shadows danced on the walls. The wind whistled like a flute outside, but inside there was stillness. Timothy warmed his hands. Do you think storms mean we're on the wrong path? Paul poked the fire with a stick. Sometimes storms are proof you're on the right one. Satan doesn't bother chasing people going nowhere. The fire popped. Did you ever want to turn back? Timothy asked. Paul didn't answer immediately. He looked into the flames, eyes distant. Once, he said softly. Right after I met Jesus, everything I thought I knew collapsed. I felt alone, unwanted, unwelcome by the people I once called family. So why didn't you stop? Paul met Timothy's eyes. Because truth kept whispering louder than fear. Timothy nodded slowly, heart pounding. I think I want to be that kind of person. The kind who listens when it's hard. You will, Paul said, placing a hand on his shoulder. I see it already. Suddenly, a loud thud echoed from deeper in the cave. The travelers jumped. What was that? Timothy whispered. They listened. Another thud, then a low, rough growl. Paul stood. Stay behind me. Two others lit torches. The firelight flickered down the long cavern wall. Then they saw it. Eyes gleaming in the dark. A wild dog, thin and desperate, had crept in from the other end of the cave. Its fur was soaked, and its ribs showed like the lines in dry clay. Paul didn't flinch. He stepped forward, slowly, calmly. Timothy's hand clutched the scroll tighter. Paul knelt and reached into his satchel. Slowly, he broke off a piece of dried bread and laid it gently on the stone floor. The dog paused, sniffed, then inched forward. Even wild things, Paul murmured, can be tamed by grace. The animal took the bread and slinked back into the dark. Timothy exhaled. That was amazing. Paul smiled. Not everything needs to be fought. Some things just need to be fed. They sat back down as the storm began to ease. Timothy looked at the fire, then at Paul, then at the scroll in his lap. He didn't know it yet, but one day he would write letters too, letters that would outlive kings and empires. But for now, he held the one from home. And that was enough. By the third week, Timothy's feet were blistered and his voice was hoarse, but his heart had never been more alive. They had crossed hills, valleys, and riverbeds, slept under fig trees and in barns, spoken to crowds and to widows and to fishermen and former thieves. And everywhere they went, Paul preached the same message with the same fire. Jesus lives, grace is real, and it's for everyone. Now they stood on the edge of a new city, gray stone buildings rising in neat rows, walls wrapped in ivy, streets pulsing with people. Timothy took it all in with wide eyes. What's this place called? Troas, Paul answered, a city that loves knowledge but forgets truth. It was louder than Lystra. Horse carts rumbled down tight alleys. Street musicians plucked harps with crooked fingers. Merchants argued over scales. And in the center of it all stood a massive columned hall where philosophers gathered like crows. Timothy followed Paul into the square, overwhelmed. How do we start here? Paul grinned. You don't start loud, you start listening. So they listened. To the poor man with sorrow in his story, to the old woman who said her gods never answered, to the boy who wanted meaning but only found noise. And after listening, Paul stood. He didn't shout. He didn't condemn. He simply lifted his voice and said, I come to tell you of a God you don't know, but who knows you. A God who doesn't live in temples but in hearts. A God who sent his Son not to rule with power but to rescue with love. People turned. The air changed. Timothy watched them gather. Not all understood, but some leaned in, hearts cracking open like seeds in spring. Suddenly, a group of scholars stepped forward. They looked Paul over with raised eyebrows. You speak boldly, one said, but what proof do you have? Paul didn't flinch. The proof is that I was once full of pride and cruelty, but I met Jesus, and now my life is his. The scholar smirked. Your story is not a scroll. Paul smiled. Number. But sometimes stories carry more weight than scrolls. Timothy's heart thumped. He remembered Lois's words. Truth isn't always loud, but it's always alive. After the crowd thinned, one of the scholars approached Timothy quietly. "Young man," he asked, "do you believe all this, even at your age?" Timothy hesitated for a breath. Then he straightened. "I believe it because I've seen it. My grandmother lived it. My mother lives it. And now I do." The man studied him, then nodded and walked away. That night, under a canopy of stars on the roof of a borrowed home, Timothy sat beside Paul and whispered, "I was scared to speak." Paul didn't laugh. He just looked up at the stars and said, "Me too sometimes." "You?" Timothy asked. Paul nodded. Courage isn't the absence of fear. It's choosing to speak anyway. Timothy looked down at the city below. Lamps flickered in windows like fireflies. And for the first time, he realized his voice might echo here too. Not because he was strong, but because God's truth had taken root. And now it was growing. The days in Troas turned into weeks. Paul taught every morning in the square. Timothy listened, studied, memorized. He sat with beggars, ate with widows, and once even debated a stubborn merchant who thought Zeus controlled the weather. But one morning, just after sunrise, a boy ran breathlessly into the courtyard where Paul and Timothy were sitting. He held out a scroll. "From Lystra," the boy gasped, "for Timothy." Timothy's heart jumped. He took the scroll with shaking hands, recognizing the stitching on the edge. The thread was blue, his grandmother's favorite color. Paul smiled. "From home?" Timothy nodded, too choked up to speak. He unrolled it slowly. It wasn't fancy, just a few lines in careful script. "My dear Timothy, the figs are ripening early this year. I know you like the dark ones best. Eunice says your letters are too short. I say they are just right, as long as they are honest. We pray for you every morning. The path you're on is no longer just ours. It's yours now. Let it be lit by the word and steady beneath your feet. And if the road grows heavy, remember, our ceiling is your floor. Love you more than the olives and more than the stars, Grandma Lois." Timothy wiped his face. He hadn't noticed the tears had come until Paul handed him a cloth. "She always says stuff like that," Timothy murmured. Simple words, but they hit harder than any speech. Paul looked at him with deep approval. "That's because truth doesn't need volume, just roots." Timothy clutched the scroll to his chest. "I want to write like that someday." "You will," Paul said, "and people will remember your words the way you remember hers." Later that night, Paul gave Timothy a surprise. "I'm sending you ahead tomorrow," he said, sitting by the fire. Timothy blinked. "Alone?" "Not alone," Paul replied, "with Silas. The churches in Macedonia need encouragement. I've seen your faith, Timothy. It's time others do too." Timothy stared into the fire. The flames flickered like memories. He thought of Lois, spinning wool, of Eunice with her jars of figs, of the garden, the porch, the words traced in the dust. He thought of the scroll in his bag and the burning in his chest, and he said, "Then I'll go." Paul nodded. "Write them truth. Speak it, even if your voice shakes." Timothy looked up at the stars. "Like Lois?" Paul smiled. "Exactly like Lois." The road to Macedonia was steep and stony, winding through pine forests and steep ravines. Silas was older, steadier, and didn't talk much, but Timothy didn't mind. His mind was louder than any conversation. He replayed Lois's words over and over. Our ceiling is your floor. He didn't fully understand it, but it felt big, like an invitation to rise higher. When they arrived in the city of Philippi, the streets buzzed with trade. Bright cloths hung from stalls, smoke curled from bakers' ovens. But beneath the noise, Timothy could feel it. Something spiritual, something heavy. These people were hungry for truth. They just didn't know it yet. That afternoon, they were invited to a gathering by the river. A group of women met there regularly to pray. Timothy didn't know what to expect. He had never led anything before, not without Paul at his side. His heart pounded as they walked to the water's edge. Silas leaned in. You'll speak today. What? Timothy's voice cracked. They're ready, and so are you. Timothy wanted to protest, to say he was too young or too unsure, but instead he stepped forward. Slowly, carefully, prayerfully. The women turned as he approached. Some looked curious, others skeptical. A few smiled kindly. He cleared his throat. My name is Timothy. I come from Lystra. My grandmother taught me to believe long before I ever saw a miracle. She showed me that real faith doesn't need applause. It grows in kitchens and gardens and quiet hearts. They leaned in. He took a deep breath and opened the scroll he carried, Lois's scroll. She wrote these words for me, but maybe they're for you too. And he read them aloud, not with the booming voice of Paul, but with something else, something rooted, something real. The women listened in stillness. When he finished, an older woman wiped her eyes. We've heard many teachers, she said, but you carry peace. Another woman nodded. It's like your voice isn't just yours. It carries someone else's strength. Timothy smiled. That's probably my grandma. They laughed. And just like that, the truth had landed. Softly, deeply, exactly where it was needed. That night, as the moon shimmered across the river, Timothy wrote in his journal, I spoke today, with trembling hands and a full heart. They listened. Not because I was powerful, but because the truth was. He folded the parchment, tucked it in his pack beside Lois's scroll, and whispered into the dark, Thank you, God, for making room for my voice. The next few weeks felt like a dream. Timothy spoke in homes lit by lanterns and on porches where grapevines curled along the beams. He answered questions in alleyways, prayed with strangers in courtyards, and even sang psalms with children who didn't know Hebrew but clapped to the rhythm anyway. And everywhere he went, people asked him the same thing, Where did you learn this? He always answered the same way. In a small house, with a faithful woman, and a quiet fire that never went out. News of his teaching traveled fast. One morning, while preaching in Thessalonica, a messenger arrived, dusty, breathless, eyes wide. Paul's coming, the boy gasped. He's just a few days behind you. Timothy's heart leapt. He hadn't seen Paul in weeks. When Paul finally arrived, his robe travel-worn and his face sun-weathered, he greeted Timothy with a bear-like hug and a glowing grin. You've been busy, Paul said. I've been doing what you taught me. No, Paul said. You've been doing what God planted in you. That night, they sat by the fire under a cedar tree. Paul held out a folded letter. I've been writing to the churches, he said, encouraging them to hold fast. Timothy nodded. Then Paul added, One day you'll write your own letters too. Timothy hesitated. You think they'll listen to me? Paul didn't answer right away. He just reached into his satchel and pulled out a small scrap of parchment, a bit of one of Timothy's sermons that someone in Philippi had copied. I think they already are, Paul said. Timothy held the scrap like it was holy. His words, written down, carried, passed from hand to hand. He swallowed hard. It feels like something's starting. Paul nodded. It is. And your name, Timothy. It'll be remembered not because of how loud you spoke, but because of who shaped your voice. Timothy looked down at his hands. They were stronger now, calloused from travel, ink-stained from notes. But they still remembered the feel of garden soil and warm bread and the edge of a wool spindle. They were still Lois's grandson's hands, and he was proud of that. As the fire crackled, Paul asked, "What will you tell them next?" Timothy smiled. That faith isn't born in crowds or scrolls, but in quiet kitchens, steady prayers, and the love of one person who never gave up. Paul leaned back, eyes full of peace. The fire's spreading, he whispered. And it was. Years passed. The roads Timothy once walked as a boy became the same roads he now led others along. Towns remembered him, not because he was loud, but because his words healed. Churches looked to him, not because he demanded respect, but because he had earned it in the quiet way he served. He was no longer the shy boy clutching a scroll. He was a shepherd now, of people, of truth, of the next generation. But no matter how far he traveled, he always carried two things with him: a worn letter from Paul and a scroll from Lois. One night, while resting in Ephesus, Timothy lit a small lamp and unfolded the scroll once more. The corners were frayed, the ink had faded in spots, but her handwriting still felt alive. Let it be lit by the word and steady beneath your feet. He smiled. Outside, the city glowed with torchlight. Inside, his heart stirred. A knock came at the door. A young man peeked in, barely older than Timothy had been when Paul first found him. "Teacher, the new believers are gathered. They want to hear you speak." Timothy rose, folding the scroll with care. "Then let's give them more than just words," he said. "Let's give them what was passed down." As he stepped out into the courtyard, faces turned toward him, eager, curious, searching, just like he once had been. He began not with a sermon, but with a story. "There once was a woman named Lois," he said. "She wasn't a prophet. She never led a crowd. She didn't wear robes or crowns, but she had a fire in her heart, a quiet one, a faithful one, and it changed the world through her grandson." The crowd leaned in. "She taught me to love Scripture before I could even read it. She taught me to pray before I could preach. And because she stayed faithful in the small things, I learned how to be faithful in the big ones." He paused. "And now, I pass it to you." As the people listened, the flame of that old oil lamp flickered gently beside him, a reminder that even the smallest light, when protected and passed on, can burn across generations. And somewhere far away, in a quiet home in Lystra, perhaps the olive trees still rustled at night and the garden still grew. But the fire Lois lit, it was no longer just in one house. It was in cities, in churches, in hearts, because faith that starts in the home can shape future generations of world changers. And it had.